The Rebbe Zilgazunzain began the Farbrengen this afternoon that today is Shabbos Parshas Boy. And it has a very strong shaykhs to the Friedeke Rebbe, whose Yortzeit will be next Shabbos, Yud Shvat. However, being that we are already in the month of Shvat, and though by Yidden Take, whenever a Yontef is set, or any other Inyan is set, it is usually set according to a date. In other words, this and this day, and this month. However, if we were to look at it from another perspective, the Friedeke Rebbe passed away on Parshas Boy, and it was Shabbos Parshas Boy. So the way it is this year, though it is not Yud Shvat, which is the Yortzeit day, when the Friedeke Rebbe really passed away, however, it is Shabbos Parshas Boy, which was when the Friedeke Rebbe passed away in Tavshin Yud, Yud Shvat fell out on Shabbos Parshas Boy. So Shabbos Parshas Boy does have a very obvious shaykhs to the Friedeke Rebbe. Furthermore, we know, the Zohar tells us, that Shabbos gives bracha into the entire week. And it would be wrong to say that when Shabbos gives bracha to the entire week, it refers only to the 6 days of the week, and not to the Yom HaShabbos, to the forthcoming Shabbos. Because if Madachet gives bracha to the Vachadike days, it definitely will give bracha to the day of Shabbos, to the forthcoming day of Shabbos. Though Shabbos in itself, on one hand, is extremely blessed, the Torah tells us that the Rebbe gave a separate amount of bracha into Shabbos. However, at the same time, we know that it is the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, wherever there could be more bracha, He definitely wants more bracha. So when we say Shabbos minay mizboch in kulhu yomin, that Shabbos gives bracha into the entire week, it means that today, this Shabbos, though it is 3 days in the month of Shvat, this gives bracha to the entire week until next Shabbos, and including next Shabbos, which is 10 days in the month of Shvat. So again, we have a very close association and close shaykhs between this Shabbos and the Shabbos of Yud Shvat, which is the Yom HaYortzeit of the Friedeke Rebbe. Another Inyan has taken place, and this, the Rebbe says, is the reason what brought about that there should be a Farbrengen today. Though, according to the regular routine schedule, there was no schedule for a Farbrengen today, and there wouldn't have been a Farbrengen until next Shabbos. However, there are guests that arrived, the Rebbe said. And what he's referring to by guest is, we know that the Inyan of greeting a guest is extremely great and outstanding, as Chazal tell us, G'dayla hachnosas orchim yoisa mekabalas pnei hashchina, that to greet guests is yet greater than greeting the Shechina. Here we are talking about a different kind of guest. We're talking about guests which are new editions of the Tanya, which were printed in various cities and countries throughout the world. And when the Rebbe came into the Farbrengen, and Rabbi Klein coming in along together with him, brought along a package in a bag, and this bag was put on the Rebbe's table throughout the entire Farbrengen. In fact, at the end of the Farbrengen, when the Rebbe went to Mincha, the Rebbe took this bag into his hand himself and took it with him to Mincha and walked out with it afterwards. In this bag, the Rebbe had all the new Tanyas which arrived to him recently, which the Rebbe says this is a tremendous accomplishment, and they were printed very proper and everything was done extremely accommodating, much faster, more than even anticipated. And the printing of the Tanya in any country or city, wherever there is a Jewish community, the Rebbe says, is of great importance. And as the Rebbe spoke later in the Farbrengen, and mentioned it here as well, we not only mean in Inyan of printing the Tanya, it is also meant that to the Yidden of that area, naturally we leave them quite a number of Tanyas for them as well. It is very meaningful that when a Yid walks into a shul walks into a house and sees a Tanya that was printed in his own community, in his own city where he lives, it is very meaningful to him. Though the Tanya was printed in many, many places and very... However, when an individual in a certain city and in a certain country opens a sefer, there is the Tanya and there is other Sfar. However, when he finds that the Tanya was printed in his city, this brings about, this awakens with him a certain kind of an association between himself and the Tanya. And therefore, for those Yidden and in those communities where the Tanya was just now printed, this will definitely bring about, for those Yidden who until now did not have a Kviyas in the Tanya, were not learning Tanya, this will bring them to learning Tanya. The Rebbe spoke later in the Farbrengen that he suggested that it would be very appropriate that immediately, right after a Tanya is printed, in any city or community, in any area, it would be very advisable that right then and there on the spot, a kviyas should be made right away in the Tanya, regardless what perek or what inyan in Tanya, or where in Tanya. This, he said, could be decided on the spot by the participants who took care in this inyan, who were involved in this inyan. However, the main thing is that right away Yeshia should take place in the Tanya. The Rebbe said the binding of the Tanya may even take place later. Maybe it has to be sent to another city or to another place to be bound. However, even before it is bound, right away to learn in the Tanya. Rebbe referred that the Tanya originally was also, the Alter Rebbe writes in the Hakdama, it was kunteresim. It was little pamphlets. And later it was formulated the Sefer HaTanya later, when it first came about as a Sefer. Where do we find a shayches between the inyan of the Tanya and this week's Sedra? Rebbe said there is a very obvious shayches. Based on the teaching of Alter Rebbe of Leben mit der Zeit, that we have to live with the times. And if we look into today's Parsha Chumash, at the end of Parshas Bo, the Shia Chumash, which has to be learned today, which is from Shvi to the end of the Sedra, it is the Parsha, which is one of the Parshas which we have in our Tefillin. The Parshas which we have in our Tefillin. Thank you. And in fact, these are the first Parshas in our Tefillin. What shayches does this have to Tanya? The Alter Rebbe himself writes in the Shablat of the Tanya, on the cover page of the Tanya, that the idea of the Tanya is to instill the idea of kikori ve'lecha hadava miyoid beficha u'bilvavcha la'asaysay. How close it is, this dava, naturally what do I mean by dava? The thing of being associated with the Eibishter, beficha u'bilvavcha and la'asaysay. So actually the pasuk is discussing three different categories. And as the Rebbe explained, these three categories refer basically to machshava, dibur, and maisa. They're in yonim of machshava, they're in yonim of dibur, and they're in yonim of maisa. Going a step further, there are mitzvahs which we fulfill through machshava, there are mitzvahs which we fulfill through dibur, and there are mitzvahs which we fulfill through maisa. These inyanim are called the asiyah, the action in each and every one of these levels. In other words, there's an action, there's a ma'aseh in machshava, which is the fulfillment of certain mitzvahs, which these mitzvahs can only be fulfilled through machshava, which is basically avas Hashem, yiras Hashem, and similar type of mitzvahs. Then there are mitzvahs which are fulfilled through dibba, primarily the mitzvah of tefillah, of davening. So just to cite one example. So, this is the inyan of asiyah shebedibur. This is the action of dibur, the fulfillment of a mitzvah which is brought down into actuality, which is the whole inyan of mitzvahs. Ha-maisa hu'aika. Then we have the third category of maisa, which is where most mitzvahs, the way most mitzvahs are fulfilled, by performing the mitzvah in whatever shape it has to be performed. These mitzvahs that have to be fulfilled through Maisa, if we were to do only the machshava, if we were to have only intentions, kavanas, and so forth, let it be the best, most proper intentions. If we are lacking the actual doing of the mitzvah, we did not fulfill the mitzvah. There are 3 mitzvahs where al pi halacha, not only are we mechuyev to do the mitzvah, to be mekayim the mitzvah, but at the same time we are obligated to have kavanah in these mitzvahs. And this is kavanahs which are discussed in Shulchan Aruch. What the kavanah of these mitzvahs are. One is the mitzvah of sukkah. Mitzvah of sukkah, we enter a sukkah from Yontif of Sukkahs. However, there's a special siman in the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch tells us that when we enter the sukkah, we have to have our intention that the reason we are sitting in a sukkah is because the pasuk tells us, "L'man yedu deireseichem ki basukos hoishafti es b'nei Yisrael." We are doing this to know that the Rebishter has put our ancestors into sukkos, and that is why we today do this mitzvah. Here, by sukkah, the kavanah is part of the mitzvah. In other words, not only do we physically have to go into a sukkah and eat in the sukkah, we are also obligated to have this intention to fulfill part of the mitzvah. The same applies to the mitzvah of tzitzis. Tzitzis has the kavanas which we are supposed to have by fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzis. And the same also applies to tefillin, which is the inyan which is discussed in today's Sedra, which is also a mitzvah which comes along with kavanah. The kavanah of tefillin is l'shabeit hamoyach v'halev, which tefillin calls for dedicating our mind and hearts to the service of the Rebbeinu Shalom. That is why we put tefillin on our hand opposite our hearts, and we put tefillin on our head, which just shows that the intellect and the midas of seichel and midas of a yid, the moyach and the leiv, have to be dedicated to the Eibishter. These mitzvahs are mitzvahs who are refined in halacha, the exception that it is not enough fulfilling the mitzvah in the sense of maaseh, but it also calls for an inyan of machshava to fulfill the mitzvah. Machshava, kavanah. There is a kavanah ha-mitzvahs which is part of the mitzvah. If we were to look into these 3 mitzvahs separately, is the emesis, tefillin, is a chayvas gavra. It is an obligation on the gever, on the person, every male, every Jew. Once he's mechuyev b'mitzvahs, is obligated to put on tefillin daily, on every weekday. Tzitzis is not a chayvas gavra. There is nowhere that says, there is no obligation on the person to wear tzitzis, halachically. Halachically, the obligation is, if we have a 4-cornered beged, we cannot wear this beged unless the beged has tzitzis. But again, these 3 mitzvahs have this inyan in common, that they all require kavanah to the fulfillment of the mitzvah. So Mamela, the inyan of the Tanya, where this Tanya in general stresses the great inyan of hamaisa hua'ika. That's what Bechlal Alter Rebbe in Tanya stresses. The greatness of Asiya, the greatness of Maisa. But based on the Hakdam of the Tanya, where Alter Rebbe stresses the inyan of Kikare ve'elecha hadava miyoid beficha belvavcha la'asoisoi, this is very much has a shaykhus to the inyan of this week's Sedra, where we find an inyan that also requires kavanah, not only the fulfillment of the mitzvah in Maisa, but also an inyan of kavanah, and this is the mitzvah of tzitzit, the mitzvah of tefillin, which is the parsha which we learn in today's Shia Chumash, is a part of the parshas in the tefillin.
So what's the connection now with the Alter Rebbe?
The Alter Rebbe? Because
with Frierdiker Rebbe?
This has a shaykhus to the Alter Rebbe. To Nesiach, the Rebbe expressed themselves as follows. It has a shaykhus to Nesiach Chabad, and particularly, shaykhus to Nesiach Chabad is very obvious, based on the Tanya, which the Tanya is the Torah Shebiksav of Torah Chassidus. Mamela, it has a shaykhus to all the Rebbe, to all of Chassidus Chabad, an inyan of Tanya, especially something which is based on the Hakdam of the Tanya. Sharblat. It is also today the 3rd day in the month of Shvat. And the third day in the month of Shvat, according to the Shiura Mechitas, when it comes to the Shia Tehillim, we begin with Kapitel Yud Ches. And this is where David praises the Rabbeinu Shleilam for saving him mikaf kol oivav, from all his enemies, umiyat Shaul, and from also Shaul, who David looked at, who was an enemy to him. Which this is the beginning of this kapitel of the Shir of today's day, which expresses David's thanks to the Rebishter, how the Rebishter has saved him from all his sin and from all his enemies. The kapitel concludes, the last word, Magdil Yeshua Ismalkoi, Oisa Chesed Lemshichoi, LeDavid Elazari Adaylam. That the Rabbeinu Shleilam performs great Yeshua's great inyanim of assistance, of helps, does Chesed Lemshichoi to David and to his children forever. The Rebbe also quoted the last psukim of the Shia Tilim, which is towards the end of the Shia, the end of Kapitel Chav Beis. Yavayu v'yagidu tzidkasai la'am noilat kiyasa. Pasuk before that is Zera yavdenu yisuper la'adinoi la'doyer. Yavayu v'yagidu tzidkasai la'am noilat kiyasa. It'll be known the righteousness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and whatever He has done. Kiyasa. And the Rebbe stressed very strongly how everything is reflected. Oisa chesed l'mshichai la'am noilat kiyasa. All the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always revealed through Maaseh, through his action. If the Rabbeinu Shalom wanted to show his greatness in Mitzrayim, which is again back to the Sedra we are in Pashas Boi, how did the Rebbe to show his Yad Chazaka? How was quoted the pasuk? I don't recall it at the moment. How did the Rabbeinu Shalom show it? It is all shown through the Asiyah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Through his Asiyah, various Nisim, various Makis which the Rebbe performed, this is how he comes about to show his greatness, his power throughout the entire world. The Rebbe says, Yisupa, the Rebbe stressed in Chassidus, it is touched, also has a shaykhs to the word sapir, to the word shining. Even sapir, a shining stone, a shining diamond. In other words, the Rabbeinu Shalom reveals his koiches into this world, all through Asiyah, only through the inyan of the koyach Asiyah, to such an extent that the koyach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be shining and illuminating in the world, in this Olam HaAsiyah. It is all through Maaseh. Rabbi also quoted the Alter Rebbe, where the Alter Rebbe writes about the greatness of Yutas Kislev. Higdil v'hifli Hashem lasos ba'aretz, where the Rebbe has performed tremendous nisim, which was recognized by all Jews, and even non-Jews recognized the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the great nisim which were performed then. It is all through the inyan of Asiyah. And here, the Rebbe spoke about HaKadosh Baruch Hu performing and showing His greatness, which ultimately this would lead to the coming of Mashiach. As the Mittal Rebbe expressed himself, that Chavlei Mashiach, which is brought in Svarim and Chazal, that the tzaras which people will go through before the coming of Mashiach. So the Mittal Rebbe expressed himself that Chavlei Mashiach we already had enough. There's no need for any more. And it is the Frierdiker Rebbe who came out with a famous quotation when the Frierdiker Rebbe arrived here in the United States: La'alter l'tshuva, la'alter l'geula, and la'alter l'tshuva. Immediately for an immediate call for geula, an immediate call for tshuva. In other words, that comes hand in hand. When there is a call for geula, there is a call for tshuva. This will bring about to geula. And in this inyan, while talking about this inyan, the Rebbe also referred that there are constantly those that are having a milchama against David. Who is David? David is the Mashiach Hashem. David Malka Mashiach. And David has his enemies, Mekaf Kol Oivav, and there's also the Shaul, who is the enemy of David. And the Rebbe explained, we're not talking about Shaul as Shaul was a Mashiach Hashem, appointed by the Rebbe and designated by the Rebbe to serve as a king. Here we are looking at Shaul from the aspect how Shaul was an enemy to Malka Mashiach. What would be the end, the soif, of those who are enemies to Melech HaMashiach and interfere to the revealing of Mashiach. Gemara tells us that whoever kol ha'chinif l'rasha seifei neufel b'yodei. It's expression in Chazal. Whoever is machnif, would be the proper translation of chanifa.
Flatters? That's the way it's
Probably.
used today.
Probably. Flatters a rasha. Mother says the end will be neufel b'yodei. He will fall into his hands. Rebbe says every expression in Chazal is extremely accurate. Chazal expressed himself. If one is machnif to a rasha, he flatters a rasha. What will be his end? His end will be neufel. He will fall. He will have his mapala. He will fall down. If he may have been on whatever type of a level until now, by being machnif la rasha, he will neufel. He will fall. Fall spiritually. And to such an extent of liyadai. In halacha we know there's a concept. In Nigla and Gemara there's an inyan of yad reflects an inyan of balbatishkeit, an inyan of a power, of authority, of reshus. Here it is said that whoever is a machnif la rasha, what will be his end? Seifei neufel, he will have his nefila, and biyadai, this rasha will gain total control of him. And we're talking about total control to the extent that he will be will have to serve as an eved to this rasha. All this comes as this is all the penalty for those who interfere with the Melech HaMashiach, for those who are enemies, who are soinim, oivim, as the pasuk says in today's Yom Tilim. To David HaMelech, reflecting the idea of David Malka Mashiach, this will be their saif, that neif will be yadai, biyad HaRasha, to whoever they are machnif. While talking about this inyan, and tying it into the inyan of Mitzrayim, but Mitzrayim, the Rebbeinu Shleilim also showed his greatness, and it was reflected through the koyach ha'asiyah. Everything has to be reflected through asiyah. The Rebbe tied it into the inyan of Makas Choshech, that when it was a Makas Choshech in Mitzrayim, that is when the Yidden had an opportunity to go into the Mitzrim and see exactly what they have, so that later when the Rebbe told them that before leaving Mitzrayim they should go V'shal Isha Mishchento Migoras Beisa, they should take things from the Mitzrim, they knew exactly what every Mitzri had. And the Rebbe said the Mitzrim couldn't even deny it, that we do not possess such type of things, because the Yid was well aware that the Mitzri possesses it, and knew even where it was standing in his house. So the Yid at that time showed the proper Ga'on Yankov, the proper Jewish pride, not being afraid of the Mitzri. Even when the Mitzri told him that he does not have such an item, the Yid had enough pride within him to tell him, I know you do have it, and here it is standing in your house. How can you tell me you don't have such a thing? And then the Mitzri was forced to give this particular thing to the Yid. So Rebbe referred to what has been going on in our generation, where Yidden did not have the proper Ga'on Yankiv, the proper Jewish pride, and therefore Yidden made tremendous concessions to the Mitzrim, giving away such tremendous inyanim, things that are so vital to the existence of Eretz Yisrael and Yidden that live there, as the Rebbe cited that Eretz Yisrael went and gave away the oil, the naft, which the Rebbe says this is something which is literally needed for the existence. It's not a side inyan. Today, as inyanim are set up, oil is of extremely important, and it's very vital to the existence of Eretz Yisrael. So they did such a wrong thing that they went ahead and gave such tremendous and important inyanim away to the Mitzrim. The Rebbe said, if we look back to Jewish history, we look back into the Yemei Abinayim, the medieval days, or if we look a little further in the Gzeiras of Tach V'Tat, there were terrible Gzeiras and programs then on the Yidden. So we find in history of those times that the Goyim approached the Yidden and suggested to the Yidden that we would be more than willing to give up our battle against you. We would let you go, we would not do you any harm. However, the Goyim insisted on one condition, that any type of arms which the Yidden possessed, the Yidden should promise them to dispose of these arms. Whether giving it away to the Goyim or dispose of it, they should not hold on to it. This was the condition which the Goyim put as a condition that then they will not harass the Yidden anymore. The Rebbe said those groups of Yidden, and there were very, very few of them, that gave in to the Goyim on such type of a request regretted it later, because the Goyim naturally did not mean it. Those Yidden that did not give in to this request, and on the contrary, said that they will never agree to such a type of a request, they will never give up certain type of weapons which they have to possess in order to defend themselves, those were the Yidden that remained safe. The same thing the Rebbe says has happened now. An inyan which is of extreme importance to the existence of Eretz Yisrael, this is something which Yidden went out of their own will, and went and gave this back to Mitzrayim. And this is something which never should have been done and never had the right to be done. This literally endangers the existence and the life of Yidden and Eretz Yisrael. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe referred to a Rashi in this week's Sedra, as well as to a continuation of the interpretation of the Rashi in last week's Sedra. First, the Rebbe raised the question in this week's Sedra. In Pashas Boy, Kapitel Yud Aleph, thank you, Pasuk Zayin, this after Revi. Moshe is talking to Paroi, and Moshe is telling Paroi about Makas Preiros. Here we come to Pasuk Zayin. Says, Pasuk Vav actually says, there'll be a tremendous crying and screaming in all of the land of Mitzrayim. Something which there never was like it, never happened and never will be. Then the Pasuk goes on, and to all the Yidden, a dog will not bark. To a Yid, or even to a Yiddish behemoth. Laman Teidu, so that you shall know, Hashem Yisrael. Actually, what the second half of the pasuk is trying to bring out, that there is a division between the Yidden and the Mitzvah. Fine. What does Moshe give as an introduction? That to a Yid, a dog is not even going to bark. What shaykhs does this have to this whole union here? Pasuk is discussing Makas Preiros. Later in this latter part of Pasuk Zayin tells us that there will be an obvious differentiation, Yafla Hashem, Bein Mitzrayim or Bein Yisrael. What comes as an introduction to this Pasuk? Moshe says, in the name of the Rebishter, that L'chayil b'nei Yisrael la'yechatz kelav l'shayin, l'meishvad b'heim. We have gone through already 10 Makkos. Many of these 10 Makkos involved behemoths, involved animals, whatever. The Pasuk didn't tell us that it came to the Tzvardim didn't shepherd the Yidden. There was the Orev, a mixture of so many behemoths, and these behemoths did not do any harm to the Yidden, did not turn to the Yidden, did not bother the Yidden. The Pasuk doesn't say that. Comes here to Makas Preiros, kind of mentioning about a dog. What shaykhs does it have? The emes is that there is a commentary from the Balei Tosfos. The Balei Tosfos want to say, based on a Gemara. Gemara tells us that when the Malach HaMavis appears, that is when the dogs get very excited. It's a Gemara. And being that here the Malach HaMavis appeared to perform Makas Preiros, that's how you want to say the Shaykhs. So Pasuk tells us that L'chayil b'nei Yisrael lo yechatz kelav l'sheni, that to the Yidden the dogs would not bark. First of all, Rashi doesn't say anything like it. And in Pshuta Shel Mikra, it's based on a Gemara, but in Pshuta Shel Mikra there's no such inyan. Also, the Gemara does not say that the Jews, that when there's a Malach HaMavis around, the Kelev is Chayretz. That's not what the Gemara says. Gemara tells us that when the Malach HaMavis appears, the dogs get excited, that's all the Gemara says. Furthermore, if we look in Tanakh and we want to find a proper expression on the barking of a dog, there's a pasuk. And the pasuk does not use the word yechatz. The pasuk uses the word, the word which in Hebrew means barking, noiveach. And the pasuk does not even mention this word. Pasuk uses a completely different expression. The pasuk uses an expression of yechatz. And when it comes to Rashi does not raise any question how this whole Indian has a shaykhs here. But Rashi quotes the words, Lo yechatz kelev l'shoyneh. And Rashi comes with a whole long interpretation. What is the source of the word yechatz? So first of all, why does Rashi have to quote all the words Lo yechatz kelev l'shoyneh? If all Rashi is out to interpret is the word yechatz, and where in Tanakh we find yechatz, then let Rashi just quote yechatz and interpret yechatz. No. What Rashi does, he quotes Lo yechatz kelev l'shoyneh. There are some that want to say that Rashi quotes a pasuk in Yeshua. And there's a pasuk in Yeshua, Lo yichoratz livnei Yisrael. So being that there in Yeshua, the pasuk uses the expression, Lo yichoratz livnei Yisrael, so it's some sort of like, corresponds to the pasuk here, Lo choil b'nei Yisrael, Lo yechatz kelev l'shoyneh. But it's very strange that a pasuk in Shmais is based on a consideration with a pasuk in Yeshua. Pasuk. Furthermore, when Rashi is interpreting here Pashas Bay, Rashi is learning with a child who is learning Chumash. The child has not yet learned Yeshua, and Rashi is not out to involve the child in interpretation of a pasuk in Yeshua. So all that's really required to understand is why the pasuk is using the expression L'chol b'nei Yisrael. Why the pasuk here expresses itself with the word yechatz, and this is what Rashi is coming to teach yechatz. So Rashi should have quoted only yechatz. And in general, the whole idea requires an interpretation. How does the whole inyan of L'chol b'nei Yisrael yechatz kelev l'shoyneh come in here when Moshe is telling him all the details about Makas prayers? The Rebbe left this question and went back to interpret and conclude a Rashi which he spoke about in last week's Farbrengen in Pashas Ve'era. See what it was a few weeks ago when the Rebbe left an Inyan not explained, not verempfet. So it was later in the Farbrengen where the Rebbe criticized very strong how was it that nobody reacted, nobody commented, and nobody wrote into the Ha'oras HaBiyurim anything to comment on a teretz on an inyan. After last week's Farbrengen, when the Rebbe discussed the inyan of Makas Tzfardim, and the Rebbe also remained without a teretz, you were to look in this week's Ha'oras HaBiyurim, which are published by Talmidim of various meisters, where the Olei Torah, the yeshivas. There are many, many terutzim, which many individuals try to sort of guess an interpretation on the teretz, which we will get into in a minute, about the inyan of Tzfardim. So, in today's Farbrengen, again, the Rebbe did not answer this question regarding L'chol b'nei Yisrael yechatz kelev l'shoyneh. Obviously, he's giving us some assignment for the week. We should try and work on a teretz. And he went back to explain the inyan of Tzfardim. Last week in the Farbrengen, the second Makkah, which is Makas Tzfardim, the Makkah of frogs, Moshe Rabbeinu is coming to Paroi and he's telling him, Rak ba'yo'er tisha'arna. He's ready to take away the Tzfardim. However, the Tzfardim will remain in the waters. And if we look carefully into the Psukim, Moshe Rabbeinu is repeating himself twice with this idea that the Tzfardim will remain in the waters. They will leave all over wherever they were. Until now, as the Pasuk says, they flooded all over. They flooded the residences and the stoves and the ovens. They were all in the beds. They were all over. Now they will disappear. They will remain only in the waters. So the Rebbe raised the question, for what need is it for the Pasuk to tell us, Rag ba'yo'er tisha'arna, that it will remain in the water? Furthermore, why did Moshe Rabbeinu have to stress it and mention it twice, that the Tzfardim will remain in the water? Rebbe says that the various responses which he saw, which many individuals tried to respond and comment on this teretz, are really not such which can be accepted when we're learning in the realm of Pshut Shel Mikra. We are out to learn Pshat, and if we're looking for Pshat, it is very hard to accept Terutzim that are based on Midrashim and Chazals and so forth. For example, he cited one, some that claimed they wanted to learn Pshat, that the Tzvardim, being that it is Tzvardeya, Tzvardeya could be eaten. By the Mitzrim, definitely. By the Yidden, maybe it was before Matan Torah, so perhaps the Yidden would have ate it before Matan Torah. They weren't bound to the Inyanim of Kashrus yet. That is why the Torah tells us that the Tzvardim were left by Yoir, meaning to stress, would they want to go and eat them? There are by Yoir and they can go and eat. Rebbe says it is very hard to accept such a interpretation b'derech hapshat. The pasuk keeps on saying, there's a pasuk in pasuk Yud, Vayitzbu roisam chamorim chamorim vativa sha'aretz, that they had bundles and bundles of these tzvardim and they had problems with them. So obviously, if it was something which was edible, something which the Mitzrim could have eaten, or even the Yidden Afilu could have eaten, the pasuk wouldn't have referred to it. Vayitzbu roisam chamorim chamorim vativa sha'aretz. So we must say that for whatever reason, it was definitely not possible to eat them. Furthermore, the Rebbe quoted as brought in Svarim that the arbe, if one of the Mitzrim took an arbe, one of the grasshoppers which were brought on Mitzrayim, which was one of the plagues, and wanted to preserve this arbe, whatever means of refrigeration they had or whatever way he wanted to preserve it, if the HaKadosh Baruch Hu has taken away the arba, this particular arba, which one may have saved or preserved, lost its taste and had no taste of an arba. So again, we must say that the Tzvardim, the same thing happened with the frogs. The frogs were not, it wasn't something which, after the plague of Tzvardeya has finished, whoever wanted to eat Tzvardim was able to eat Tzvardim, but definitely not. So again, we have to find some sort of an interpretation. Why is Moshe Rabbeinu stressing to Paroi that the Tzvardim will remain in the waters? And Rashi does not give any comment on this, obviously. Rebbe says, it is definitely that Rashi has already somehow in his Pirush solved this problem as well. There is a Rashi in Pasuk Yud Zayin in Kapitel Ches in Parshas Ve'era. After the Makkah of Tzvardeya came the plague of Erev. And in this Rashi, where Rashi interprets what Orev is, Rashi says, Kol minei chayis royos, all bad animals, nechoshim, va'akrabim, snakes, all came ba'arvuvye, in a mixture, v'yu mashchisim behem, they were harming them. Then Rashi goes ahead, v'yesh tam b'dover ba'agoda. B'chol maka v'maka, lo mazu v'lo mazu. There's a tam on every single makkah, and in the sequence it came in, why HaKadosh Baruch Hu has arranged it in such a way. And the Rebbe commented right away, though Rashi is quoting a Dvar Agode, which is a Medrash, which is a Drash, however, Rashi is not bringing any, Rashi is bringing this in Pshut Shel Mikra and not bringing any other explanation in accordance to Pshat. So Mamela, it makes this Drash, this Agode, a Pshat interpretation. Because there is no different Hezber al Piderech HaPshat. So Rashi quotes an Agode that tells us that this is the derech of Tachsise Milchama. When one goes into war, two countries go into war, first you do is Mekalkel Mayinoiseha. The first thing you do is you spoil their wells, in other words, their waters. Wherever they had a source of water, which this country had, when you go into war with that country, you spoil that source of water. Then what you do is Teiken Alein Umarian B'Sheifreis. then you blow with shofars, you scare them. Liyiram ulevahalom. So Rashi uses an expression from Chazal to fear them, ulevahalom, and to tumble them. V'chein hatzvardim mekarkerim v'hoimim. K'deisa b'medrash Rabbi Tanchuma. So we see from this Rashi that the Tzvardeya accomplishes a twofold thing. First of all, it scared the Mitzrim. Secondly, it excited the Mitzrim. Liyiram ulevahalom. Actually, the first makkah which the Rebbe brought was the makkah of Dam. What happened? He took the waters of Mitzrayim, which this is the first thing in Tachsisa Melchama, as we just learned in Rashi, Mekalkil Mayin Oseha. However, the Mitzrim, they worshipped to the water. They worshipped to the Nile. And they thought that no harm could ever happen to the Nile, which they looked upon as their superpower, their union of Getchke to them. So the Rebbe showed that he brought the spoilage where not only was it something which harmed the Mitzrim by the fact that he kilkel Mayin Oseha, he spoiled their wells, but he also immediately showed them that the God in whomever they believed in the Nilus, has no power. But v'haraya, he took something which directly affected the Nilus, and the Nilus turned into blood instead of being water. This was the first makkah. So the first makkah, the Rebbe affected the Mitzrim, simultaneously not only the Mitzrim and Paroi, but affected the Getchke that the Mitzrim bowed to as well, believed in as well. It comes to the second makkah, the makkah of Tzvardeya. Here HaKadosh Baruch Hu went a step further. Because as we just learned in Rashi, this is the goal in Tachsisa Melchama, this is how the arrangement would be. He goes a step further and brings the Tzvardeya. Where did the Tzvardeya originate from? From the water. Yishchetzu Oya came from the waters. Alan Horois, ala Oirem, vala Agamim, the Pasuk says, V'ha'alas hatzvarda melaretz Mitzrayim. Here the Rebbe showed the Mitzrim a step further. Not only can the one whom they pray to and bow to, can he not help them, and that his Inyan himself turned into the contrary, as we just had, that the water turned into blood, but a step further, he is damaging them. He is bringing about an Inyan which is harming them. The Tzvardeya harmed them. Later, Pari called Moshe and asked him to stop it. Here Moshe wanted to do something which should bring about within Pari not only it's a tumlanish, confusing him, but also bring him to a stage of making him fearing of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Liyiram ulevahalom. So what Moshe did was as follows. He took away the Tzvardeya from all over. The Tzvardeya was no longer flooding Eretz Mitzrayim. Where was the Tzvardeya left? Only by Ya'ir, only in the water. Paro used to go out to the water every morning. Paro came to the water, comes to the water, he sees there is the Tzvardeya. There is the reminder. There is something which is showing him that he has to fear the Rabbeinu Shalom. The Rabbeinu Shalom, Moshe, B'Shem Hashem, fulfilled his request to take away the tzvardim from all over Mitzrayim. They're no longer in the beds and in the ovens and in the closets of the Mitzrayim. However, he left the tzvardim in one place to serve as a reminder to Parai. Parai should see that there is still the koyach, the strength of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the Rebbe is performing these makkahs, and that Parai should begin fearing Hashem. And that is why the pasuk says, Liyiram ulevahalom. The idea of Tzvardeya was to make the Mitzrim God-fearing and as well to confuse them. When he took away the Tzvardeya from all over the country and left the Tzvardeya only in the water, then it was only there to accomplish one part of the inyan, Liyiram, to make him fearing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. However, Levahalom, this already went away. This inyan, Moshe wanted to stress twice. That's why Moshe is stressing to Paroi that the Tzvardeya is left in the waters. It's not time that he's telling him, Rag Bayoyer Tisha'arno, they are left in the water without any reason. By stressing Rak by Ya'ir Tisha'ana, he says there is still a reminder to you, Parai, that the Rabbeinu Shalom has brought something out of the Ya'ir, something which originated from the thing you are praying to and bowing to every morning. From this Ya'ir, from these waters, came something which has brought damage to you, Mitzrim, and at the same time serves as a constant reminder that liyiram, to fear of the Rabbeinu Shalom. So that is why this inyan was shown at the second Makkah, not at the first. So the Rebbe explained as follows. Actually, the Rebbe could have done a similar thing by the first Makkah. After all the water turned back into water and it's no longer dam, as we just discussed, Para used to go out to the Nile every morning to the Nilas. The Rebbe should have made that a little part or a larger part of the Nilus, which is the water, which until now, by the Makkah, was blood. The Rebbe should have left part of that as blood. So that when Pari comes out every morning, he will see the Koyach Hashem, that true, the Rebbe took away the water, the blood rather, from all over Mitzrayim and turned it back into water. However, he still left it in one place to serve as a reminder to Pari. So by the first Makkah, the Rebbe didn't want to do that yet. And because, furthermore, one could ask, why did Pari have to go through a sequence of 10 Makkahs? The Rebbe could have immediately brought Makkah's prayers. The Rebbe didn't want it that way. The Rebbe went in a format of min hakal el hakovet, from the easier to the harder. So first was only a Makkah of Dam. When the Makkah of Dam was over, the Rebbe turned all the waters back into water, even the water at the Nilus. Then came the Makkah of Tzfardeya. Here we're already going a step further. It's a Makkah that not only caused an inconvenience, but it also caused harm. It was very harmful for the Mitzrim. And the harm came from the Yair, from something they were bowing to and praying to, came this harm. And here the Rebbe went a step further, that though he stopped the Makkah all over Mitzrayim, still left it in the Yair, so that when Pari should come, it should serve as a reminder, liyira, to bring him to fear, to the Rabbeinu Shalom, so that he should let out the Yidden. If this didn't help, came the third Makkah, which affected the Mitzrim yet stronger, until finally the Makkah's Preres, which after Makkah's Preres, Pari came in the middle of the night screaming, searching for Moshe Rabbeinu, and allowing him and begging him, take the Yidden and leave Mitzrayim. Being that it is Shabbos before Yud Shvat, the Rebbe says it's an appropriate time to remind everyone to utilize the day of Yud Shvat accordingly, and the preparations for the day of Yud Shvat should all be made accordingly, so that when it comes to Yud Shvat, all the inyanim which we have to utilize on this day should be accordingly and properly. And again, the Rebbe spoke here about the greatness of printing the Tanyas. And the Tanyas which are printed, wherever there is any kind of Yiddish yeshiv, of Jewish community of Yidden, and as we mentioned earlier, this brings about that the Yidden from those communities will feel themselves associated with the Tanya, because it's a Tanya which was printed by them. And even before, here is where the Rebbe suggested that immediately after the Tanya is printed, on the very same spot where the Tanya was printed, same area, it is extremely advisable right away to make a Shia in the Sefer HaTanya. The Rebbe stressed and gave very strong brachas that all the meniyas, ve'ikuvim, any types of interferences or any type of inyanim which may seem as interferences when it comes to spreading of Chassidus, whether it's through the printing of Tanya or a similar type of inyanim of spreading Chassidus, will definitely not stay in the way and will not interfere. The Rebbe referred to the bracha v'yidgu l'roiv b'kerev ha'aretz. And this is a bracha which is used b'negei fish. And b'negei fish we find that there is no inyan of an ayin hara. Rebbe said, being that we are talking in the days of Yud Shvat, the days that remind us in the Yotzeit of the Friedrich Rebbe, there's an expression in Chazal, Ano mizare de Yosef. We are from the children of Yosef, which this was the name of the Friedrich Rebbe. De lo yishalte behu eina bisha. That an ayin hara can never have any effect on Zari Shal Yosef. And therefore, Rebbe urged again, Chsidim akluge. There's an expression from the Friedrich Rebbe, that Chsidim are smart. And akluger never postpones something that can be done today to do it tomorrow. In other words, something which we have an opportunity to do, we have to do it immediately. There's no winning in postponing. Postponing never will bring to favorable results. The Rebbe gave tremendous brachas for Hatzloch and Afotas Hamayonis and Afotas Hayadus, and particularly in the Indian of printing Tanyas, and those that are giving from their time and money and effort for this great Indian of printing Tanyas, wherever Yidden are in the world. It's tremendous chus. And the Rebbe said he would give mashke at the Farbrengen to those who are involved in other countries in printing the Tanya. The Rebbe says, if there are any people here present who will be traveling closely to other countries and other cities and will be involved in printing the Tanya there, let them come over and he will give them mashke to take along from this Farbrengen, which is an Inyan of bracha in this Inyan. The Rebbe said nobody should be shy in case he's not calling this individual. There's no Inyan in being shy and holding himself back. On the contrary, just to step forth and we'll get this mashke. And the main Inyan is that the Inyan should be accomplished, and we use the expression imdu hachin kulchem, that we shall all stand ready and prepared to get the great birchas Hashem which is awaiting us. Pardon?
What's the occasion?
The occasion of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe mentioned, excuse me, just 1 second, I'll get back to you in a minute. Interesting, when the Rebbe was talking about the Tanyas which were printed recently, in fact, it was before the second Sikha, the Rebbe took the bag of Tanyas and looked into the bag very, very dearly, very favorably to it. Later the Rebbe expressed himself that amongst the Tanyas that are here, there is also a Tanya which was printed in Miron. Miron is the city of Reb Shimon ben Yochai, and we know the great closeness which exists between the Tanya and Rashbi. Rebbe also added that in this Tanya, not only was it printed in Miron, but it was also a kviyas in Tanya, in this Tanya already. In other words, after it was printed, they immediately learned how to kviyas in Tanya in Miron, and in this Tanya, not only was it printed there, but there was also a shiur in Tanya already taking place in Miron in the city of Rashbi. A gute Woche.